there's more strictness than there was under the Jewish law, which is interesting because typically we think of the Jewish law as cumbersome. And there was a lot of laws to it. But as far as like our Christian living, it's actually more strict in some ways because theirs might have been more strict or more cumbersome in like the numbers of rules. But what Jesus apparently in this sermon, and also as you look throughout your New Testament, what Jesus puts on us is matters of our heart being right. And that's exactly what this is. This is your heart being right through your eyes.
Yeah.
And so for them, he just made a rule, and here's your rule. And for us, it's like, okay, it's more than that. It's about what's in here.
Yeah.
It's not just don't commit adultery. It's don't even look at her with the intent to commit adultery.
Yeah,
or the desire.
And I'll add this too. If you disagree, hit me over the head or something. But don't hit me over the head. But it's that small thought of less than effort after someone. It's kind of like a planted seed or a small thought that's going to fester as far as taking it to that next level of sin. That's kind of another takeaway I kind of got from it too as well.
For sure. And I think another important point to make from this, because and we're older in here. We don't have a lot of really young people in here, but yeah, Mitch is older than I am, so we're older in here. But this is an important concept too. Notice that there's intent in this passage with this look. I know that especially younger men, when they're going through that process of figuring out how to control their vision, there's this guilt because maybe, and I'm saying young men because it just bears out that men are typically more visually driven than women. That doesn't mean that's a steadfast rule, but on the whole, if a young man, if an attractive woman walks by and his eyes go to that attractive woman in that moment, he thinks, "Oh, I've sinned." Well, no, you've sinned if one, you looked on her to lust after her. There's intent in that, right? Yeah. Now, it might be an attractive woman walks by and you notice that's an attractive woman, and then you say, "But she's not wearing enough clothes, and that's none of my business," and you remove your eyes from that, right? That's not what this isn't saying that you've committed adultery in your heart if that happens. If someone walks and you go, "Whoa, okay," and you get away from that. This is intent. This is that woman walks by and she catches your eye and you continue to look at her with the intent of lusting after her. That is when you have done what Jesus is talking about here. If this were just that, it's like this where someone says, look around the room for a moment and notice everything in the room that is red. There's this exercise. So just do this exercise with me right quick. Look around the room, notice everything that's red. It's mostly going to be people's clothing. There's not a lot of red in here, something over the door. Okay, look around, notice everything that's red. All right, now close your eyes and list off in your head the things that are green. And the exercise goes to show we see what we're looking for sometimes. And a person who is having issues with lust, their eyes are going to be more tending to stick on situations. In other words, this can also be a barometer of where my heart is on the subject.
Yeah.
But the main thing we need to see is this does not mean just because something caught your eye for a moment that you've committed adultery in your heart.
All right. So what kind of implications does treating our body as a temple have on handling lust? Let's go to 1 Corinthians 6:18 through 20. It says, "Flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your heart, which are God's." All right. What's some of your biggest takeaways on that, Big Matt?
I always, because I use the New King James, anytime this comes up, I always point this out. He says, "Flee sexual immorality." That's a bad translation. The King James got this right. It is fornication. There is another Greek word that means more generally sexual immorality. This is not that word. This is porneia. This is the same word Jesus uses when he says that you may divorce for porneia. You may not divorce for general sexual immorality. There are many things, such as lusting with your eyes, that are immoral, but are not divorceable. And so the New King James made a fatal error in these verses by just taking pornea across. There is one time that I know of in your Bible, and I don't remember where it is right now, but I may look it up in a moment, where they do translate pornea to fornication. Even the New King James does. And it's because in the same verse, the other word for sexual immorality is in the same verse. So they had to make it, in that space, they decided, we've got to make a distinction between sexual immorality and fornication. And so they did in that one verse. Everywhere else, they just took pornea and translated it as sexual immorality. So since I use the New King James and I preach from the New King James, I think this is true with whatever translation you use. If there's a weakness, you should make people aware of it. So that's thought number one from me. And I'm in my King James actually right now. But he says, you said what's the main takeaway? I think the main takeaway is the first two words, flee fornication. Flee fornication. Anytime God uses language like that to run, to flee, to get away from something, and it's not just an idea of avoid it, but flee from it, should indicate to me the seriousness of the problem of sin. Every sin that man doeth without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. That also, by the way, does make fornication a unique sin in the Bible. There's no other sin outlined that I know of. Maybe you can find one, but there's no other sin outlined that I know of in the Bible that God says is a sin against the body. Many sins are said against God. Many sins are said to be against my neighbor. This is the only situation, fornication, that I know of that says it's a sin against my own body. A lot of different people have debated over what that means. The main thing I think we should take away from that is that God views this in a certain kind of way. He has strong language for it. Run from it. It's not thus that you're sinning against your own body. And that brings back to the point that you said. Why? Why would he even point out it's a sin against my body, except that my body was made for a purpose? And the purpose that's in the very next line, right?
Yeah. So, like being bought. So basically, being bought from Jesus' sacrifice, our body is not our own.
Yep.
Our body's not our own, and that's what one I wanted to add on to what you were saying on that.
And that does make sense. I mean, it even makes
it's
sense.
Not our body, yeah. It
even makes sense in the sense of marriage. Why is fornication a betrayal of marriage? Well, obviously because you're breaking a vow, but also God says the two become one flesh. So you don't own your body even within the marriage compact. And
Exactly.
Certainly I don't own my own body in the light of my marriage to the Lord. So it doesn't mean that no one is ever going to commit fornication and then be forgiven of it. We see that in 1 and 2 Corinthians. It just means that it is a serious sin that needs to be repented of and corrected.
Yeah. So let's talk about the progression of temptation to sin. All right. The scripture that I have is James 1:14 through 15. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away from his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. That's kind of what I was hitting on earlier before about, having, like, you may have a small sin or a thought that's in your head, and that thought's going to come to actual deed, and then you continue in that deed.
Yeah, take action on the sin. This is a progression. To me, this was, I guess, early in my Christianity, this is one of the more comforting passages of Scripture to me. And there are still brethren that teach us this way. And if those of you who've been members of the church for very many years, especially those of you who stretch back several decades in the church, you've heard the preacher come in and basically preach to the effect that if you ever slip up, that you're going to hell. If you make a single sin, a single mistake, you're going to hell. I didn't know how prevalent that was until I started preaching, and I preached 1 John chapter 1, verses 7 through 9, and this woman who was, around 90, came to me and said, "I'm so glad you preached that, because she had married a preacher, she'd been a missionary, her family had preachers, but she said, for so many years of my life, the preachers always preached, if you make a single mistake, you go from saved to lost until you very specifically say a prayer asking God to forgive you of that mistake. That's just, first of all, that makes 1 John chapter 1, verses 7 through 9 make no sense. But second, you go to this passage in James, this makes what James says false. If that is true, then what James says here is false. And then it's not just here. We can look at another, there's a sin not unto death. Like literally talks about a sin not unto death. And I think that sin not unto death, and some people have some kind of far-fetched views on what that means, but I would say it lines up pretty well with what James says here. Now, mind you, the point of what he's saying here, and you do want to keep it in context, let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Obviously, the word temptation there means temptation to sin. God does tempt men or test them. That is, tests of faithfulness. He does not tempt men. That is, draw them towards sin. So you get into this passage, and he says, in James, and he says what? Each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own. And in your King James, what's the word? In your King James Bible, what's the word there? Drawn away of his own lust. Some Bibles will call that desire. That's really all lust is. Lust is a desire that is inordinate or inappropriate. It's translated lust here because by the context, this is clearly an inordinate or inappropriate desire. I am tempted when I am drawn away of my lust, which also tells me every one of us has lusts. If we didn't, the devil couldn't tempt us. That is, every one of us can feel desires toward things that we ought not to have. Now, that lust may be under control. That desire, we may have buffeted our bodies as Paul did. That desire may be under control, but we all can see desire in areas that are sinful. A man is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. But the reason this passage is so important, first of all, to this subject, but also just to our Christian living, is he says what? Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Go back to that analogy we gave of a man and an attractive woman walks by, and his eyes go to her. Jesus talking about committing adultery. He's not committed adultery yet. However, there are processes in his brain who could view looking at an attractive woman who's not, say, especially if she's not fully dressed, she's dressed in the manner of our culture rather than in the manner of a godly woman. He can see that there would be pleasure in looking at her. He is drawn away of his own inordinate desire. He can understand there's a desire there. He can also refuse that desire. That's temptation. He can refuse that desire and not sin. Or he can linger, and then what? It brings forth sin. Now, how many times have you caught yourself where you got caught off guard by something and you said something you shouldn't have said? Or you look somewhere you shouldn't have looked. Or and in that early moment, you go, whoa, no, this is bad. And you flee, right? And James goes on to talk about that, which is what? He commits the sin. But go back to 1 John 1:7. What does he say? We have a continual cleansing of sin, right? So he says, and when the desire is conceived gives birth to sin, and sin, listen to it, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Meaning, you're not dead the moment you sin someone in Christ. But the other problem to that is that we don't need to be haughty in that, because how do you know where that line is, as to have you crossed that line with your God? And the answer is to do, going back over to 1 John, is to do verse 8 and 9 every time you can, which is what? The moment I recognize it, what should I do? Get away from whatever it is I was getting entangled in, and pray God forgive me, and pray God deliver me from temptation. And so I think that, going through this verse, it is comforting to know that this whole light switch, on again, off again salvation is not accurate. However, again, a lot of these things we talk about today are going to have extremes. The other extreme is this. Well, you can just go ahead. Jesus will cover it. That doesn't work either. Within the blood of Christ, I'll go ahead and lust and be okay. That won't work either. We have to stay biblical. We can't go either to one extreme or the other in our conduct and remain Christians.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, looking at combating lust, how does walking in the Spirit help us combat lust? If you go to Galatians 5:16-17, it says, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you should not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. And so, walking in the Spirit, when it comes to talking to our kids and walking in the Spirit, how would you? I know I'm about to give away. My last one. So
don't give it away.
Don't give it away. So how does walking in the Spirit help us combat lust?
Well, I will say, first of all, that when you're in Romans and you're in Galatians, you got to watch and make sure that you know what the Spirit is and what the flesh is. The flesh is often used, and now it'll still work, but we need to understand something. The flesh is often used with reference to the old law. The Spirit is often used with reference to the new law. In fact, even in this passage, if you back up just a little bit, he says, the entire context of the passage, even you can go back to 11. And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? And the offense of the cross ceased. If he says, verse 13, for brethren, ye have been called unto liberty, only use not liberty for an occasion for the flesh, but the love to serve one another. The law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt be a neighbor thyself. I think one important fact is to recognize that, especially in Romans, but it happens in Galatians a good bit as well, sometimes you're actually dealing with a discussion of the old and new law, the old law versus the new law. That said, it parallels very well with still the lusts that come from the fact that we live in a physical body that has certain pleasures. And that makes sense, because if you think, why would the old law be compared with the driving of the flesh? And well, it makes sense. The old law was largely physical. Most of the inaction of it was largely physical. The new law, why would it be considered the Spirit in these analogies? Well, because as we pointed out in Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, it was said, but now I tell you, we are being called to be more consciously spiritual and have spiritual discernment that determines our path, rather than listed out and very carefully done routines. We don't have as much of that these days. I'd say all that just to come back to this. We don't want to abuse a passage, take it out of context, and yet there's a truth that you can see anytime we're talking about flesh versus spirit. That is, the flesh is representative of an improper desire. That improper desire might be to cling to the circumcision of the old law. That improper desire might be to hold to the drives or urges that are within this body. Either way, I think it's plain. Whether you're in Galatia and people are trying to teach you to go back under certain parts of the law, or whether you're a man or a woman who's struggling with the fact that there are things your body would find pleasurable that God does not, if I walk according to what I, in my body, desire, and that is the preeminence, but also I'm a Christian, right? Also I'm going to live for God, then I'm walking according to the flesh. I can't get rid of those desires in my body, but if I walk in the Spirit, that is, I put the Spirit, I put the law of Christ, I put God first, then the decisions, then yes, I'm still going to have certain desires in my body, but the Spirit and His teaching supersedes my desires. And this would be true even if you go back to them with the whole Jewish versus keeping the old law versus keeping the new law. It's still the same thing. If these men put God first, then that's going to supersede the fact that maybe they miss keeping the Passover, or maybe they miss animal sacrifices, or maybe they miss, or they just really want to bind circumcision because they think that they still think Gentiles are dirty and all that kind of stuff. If any time that we put God and let Him supersede whatever it is that I want, then you have a pretty, maybe not complete, but a decent definition of walking in the Spirit.
Yeah, we have to walk in the Spirit, meaning that you have to make sure that you're doing things that are pure. You have to make a decision on what master do you want to serve, and making that decision from being either the world, the sin, or of just being a Christian in general.
And you've got a teenage boy, we got two teenage.
I got two and possible.
Okay.
He's almost there. But he's around it where that starts. Talking about Jacob. Jacob, he's in that environment. Whereas in middle school, that's when a lot of that happens in middle school.
Yeah, and
it starts.
The reason that I bring that up is I don't have boys, and my oldest is still fairly young. But
I got you, Tom.
I don't have boys, but I know this can affect males and females. I understand that. But just getting back to that visual thing, we need to talk to both about this subject.
Definitely.
But getting back to that visual thing, just think about the world our boys are coming up in as far as billboards.
That has to be hard.
Yeah, even just driving down the street. It amazes me how much our society just puts out there that's sexual. Television, you can't watch a show, a family show will then have a commercial with naked people in it. Like, it's everywhere. So I think we don't want to get too far from our main point, which is our point is to talk to our kids about this subject, because this is not really an option. Your kids, like our kids being exposed to these things is not an option. It's a reality. Like in fact, they're inundated with it before they're even old enough to know what it is, and then they're going to have that moment where it's going to hit them. Oh, that's what that is. But it's just absolutely everywhere. And then all of them have devices in their hands, and computers in their rooms, or tablets in their room. As a parent, this conversation needs to happen. And not only does it need to happen, it also needs to be that early, and that we're helping them assure. And I've heard, listen, I was in youth ministry, and it's really hard to control your facial expressions when parents tell you, well, I know everything that happens. I know everything that she does on her phone. And I'm like, that kid is so much smarter than you when it comes to technology. Yeah. You have no clue. Explain to me how you know it. I got it set up that her text messages come through my phone too.
I'll tell you what. I'll tell you a story, Matt. I'll tell you a story. These kids, right? So we had a cybersecurity thing on the phones, the computers. These kids, they figured out a way to download an app or to download some kind of filter that unfilters the parent filters, and do what they want to do. Not saying to watch something bad, but just to watch.
You are not. That's what I'm saying. You are not outsmarting your kid with technology. Unless you have a degree in it and that's what you do every day, you are not outsmarting your kid in technology.
Go ahead, Tom.
Period. You better keep an eye on it. What does that mean? Well, just real quick, practical, because there's no point in saying that if you don't give a solution.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that you have the hand me your phone. First of all, you determine where phone. Did you know that kids don't have to be able to take cell phones and tablets and computers into their bedrooms? It's not required by law in the state of Georgia or the state of Alabama. Did you know that you can make your kid put it away on a shelf somewhere, and you could smack it out of their hand if they're at the dinner table with it and stuff like that? Yeah. But no, but in all seriousness, access, controlling times of access, but also there is a level to which we're just going to have to train and trust because we can't be there every second of the day. But you can do the hand me your phone rule. That is, your kid can they should have a lock code on their phone, but at any given moment, you should be able to walk in, pick it up, or say, hand me your phone, and you should know that code, and you should put that code in. If it doesn't work, they're in trouble. And if it does work, you can look through what's on their phone in that moment. And drive me crazy. Kids would say, well, what about my privacy?
You don't have privacy. I am your privacy.
You are in training right now. You're in training. You are earning privacy. You're in training right now. No. But even then, that really doesn't make sense because the fact of the matter is a husband and wife, they'll eventually get married and they should have that same relationship with their spouse.
Yep.
So secrecy is a big indicator, by the way. If your young one is struggling with lust in particular on devices, secrecy is your red flag.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Tom.
Going back, there was a lot of ground that you guys covered, so I'm going to talk about, we all have the ability for observation. With the observation, we need to have self-control with these issues. And the Lord is always teaching about the terms of the heart. He always sees the terms of the heart. And he's always telling us and directing us instructions to be in the Word, to overcome these lusts and these uncontrollable desires. Just playing catch up.
Yeah, that's good. And a final thought on that thing with the phones. A lot of times in years past, everybody always says that the digital stuff is a boy problem, and that's just not true anymore. First of all, it's not true even in the sense of looking at pornography. The numbers for girls is just skyrocketed over the last decade. And then the second thing is this. You got tons of kids that are committing felonies. They are sending inappropriate pictures, and that is something that a young lady, especially a young lady who's struggling emotionally and mentally, falls into more easily than a young man at times. Like this, it's not a boy problem. That has gotten a lot of attention over the years because there was a time that, at least in studies, it seemed that was mainly a male problem. But the advent of social media changed that. It sexualized women in a way, and unfortunately leads to, you want to talk about girl problems with technology. The number one girl problem we saw with technology when we were in youth ministry was anorexia and bulimia. They weren't looking at these pictures to lust after people. They were following all these models and going, I don't look like that. And, we had kids in therapy for eating disorders, and guess what their therapist's number one suggestion was? You have to get off social media. And we won't belabor that point because we covered that a while back, but if your kids are on social media, reconsider that. Reconsider that while they're children. Let them make that choice when they get older, but it is absolutely not good for their mental health.
Yeah, so, looking at like some different practical tips. I know with me, I got an oldest girl, and I kind of leave that to my wife. I'm kind of blessed to have my wife to kind of talk about that kind of stuff. I do talk to her about it, but I more so concentrate on the three boys. I know you got Ava. She's getting to that age. Mm-hmm. One of the things that has worked for me is goes back to the just in general parenting. You have to talk to those kids at an early age, at age-appropriate settings. And so as they get older, you progress more deeper, but just you have to build that relationship that they feel comfortable with you, to talk to you, and have those conversations. So one thing that I do, I try to take those conversations in an informal setting. Like we could be riding to the car, or I'm taking Eli to school in the morning, and I have a small conversation about what's going on in school, or our kids, huffing, are they smoking a lot of marijuana in the bathroom, and you find out a lot of things. Like, cause I won't go in details, but guys are smoking, they're puffing, smoking marijuana in the bathrooms. Like, how do you smoke marijuana in the bathroom in the high school? You would smell it all the way through the whole entire high school. And that starts in middle school. I had kids in middle school where I broke up, people smoking marijuana in the locker room. Like, it's ridiculous. And I'm talking 11-year-olds. But going back to that conversation, you have to Talk to your kids from that early age, because if you don't have that relationship, they won't tell you the truth. They're not going to tell you everything at all. Everybody knows that. Everybody was a kid. You didn't tell your parent everything. But they should be comfortable with coming to you about different topics that they're uncomfortable with. But it starts from that relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, good, yeah.
Yeah, Sherry was saying, and I like one particular word that you used in there, demystify. You have to be direct with your children and demystify it. And that is true, because I want to point out, it's not just that you have to talk to your child about lust and about sexual things. You have to talk to them in a way that they can actually understand it. You can't say, well, I went to my kid and said, well, you know, birds and bees, and then there's more of them in the springtime, and the stork comes, and so just stay away from boys. You know, that's not going to cut it. As Sherry's saying, you have to speak to them in a direct enough way that you demystify it. And you're right, because that's where a lot of the temptation comes in, is not knowing. And the devil used it on Eve. There's a veil between you and what's on the other side, and I know a way you can break that veil open. And that is exactly every kid that grows to adulthood, somewhere along the way, breaks that veil. And to what degree we can and what degree is appropriate for the age of that child, we need to explain what's on the other side of that veil so that they don't try to go figure it out for themselves, while they're in middle or high school. My mother taught 6th grade, and there was rarely a year that went by where she didn't have at least one pregnant girl in her class. And we're talking, that's 20-something years ago. So, it's a real thing. These young people can end up in these situations, and you're right. Demystifying it, really explaining it to them, helping them to understand it is awkward, especially in Western Christian culture. Unfortunately, we almost vilify sexuality. Sexuality is positive, it's good, it's created by God, it's a gift of God. It's just that it's appropriate within the marriage relationship. And one other extremely important point that we must not leave without saying: you talk to your children about sex and these things. Mm-hmm. Do not talk to my child about sex and these things, or we will have a very big problem. Unless I have asked you to do so. Yeah. You don't talk to my child about these things.
Definitely.
Now, and there might be a Bible class, at an older age level where they get into some of this, but I'm talking about, you just don't walk up to.
No, you don't do that.
We had a good Bible class. I want to serve. No, that's not the way to serve.
I got you, Dorita.
I was going to say that years ago I worked for the juvenile court, and I had a very good friend that was the Atlanta Fulton County juvenile court judge, very renowned judge, and I had him come down and talk to my juvenile delinquency class one morning, and one of the students asked him straight out, when should we start talking to our children about these things? And his response immediately, without thinking, in the womb. because he basically, technically what he's saying is that when you do talk to these children, you're not talking to them as their friend, you are talking to them as their parent. And so your child needs to know from the beginning that you are the parent, you're not their best buddy, and that these types of conversations are taking place between a parent and a child, and that we were talking about in the right context. That's the context that should be done.
All right, we got about 2 minutes, Tom.
A few things come to mind for me. You have to nurture the children, you have to equip the children, and you also have to cut the apron string. But you have to have that relationship with them continuously, but you still have to cut the apron string. Teach them, rear them in the ways, let them go. And continuously have a relationship like we have with the Lord.
One more big thing I want to add before we're done. As a parent, you have to look at older parents, and because they have more experience than you have. So, like with me, I would lean towards Brother Davis over there because he has Brooklyn. I have Annika; she's about to go in high school. They're already experiencing that college thing. You know what I'm saying? So, if you have a younger child, look at other parents in the church that have gone through that experience and get ideas, and that way. You can get a better understanding of how to approach those different situations.
Yeah, one of the best tools, period, as a parent is to be able to recognize other people's children that are now raised, and I'd like my children to end up that way.
Yeah.
And then talk to them about what they did.
Yep.
It's almost like that should be a requirement
Yeah.
for the leaders in the church, and it is, right?
Yeah.
Having believing children.
Good deal. All right. Thank you, guys. That was a pretty good one.